Rome, 211 AD. The imperial mint at Lyon runs through the night. Workers scrape thin layers of silver from fresh denarii before the coins leave the forge. The emperor needs to pay his legions, but the treasury is empty and the Spanish silver mines are tapped out. So the solution is simple: keep the coin the same size, but make it mostly copper. Paint it with a silver wash. By morning, 10,000 new denarii will enter circulation, each one worth less than the soldiers know. Within a generation, the coin that built an empire will be 95% base metal. The soldiers will notice. They always do. Every empire in history has collapsed the same way. Not through invasion, not through decadence, not through the moral failures that histories like to cite. Those are symptoms. The disease is always monetary. Empires rise on sound money, expand on debt, and die when the currency breaks. The sequence is so regular you can set a clock by it. By the end of this, you will know how to read the warning signs, how to see the collapse coming before it reaches the textbooks. Because the pattern does not care what language the treasury speaks or what flag flies above the mint. The pattern repeats. Here is the cycle. First stage, sound money funds the rise. An empire begins with a currency people trust. That trust is not abstract. It is backed by weight, by metal, by something that cannot be conjured from nothing. Rome's early denarius, minted under Augustus around 27 BC, was 98% pure silver. It was not a promise. It was silver. You could weigh it. That coin financed roads, aqueducts, legions. It turned a city-state into the Mediterranean world. The gold solidus that Constantine introduced in 312 AD held its value for 700 years because the weight did not lie. Spain's silver reales in the 1500s were trusted from Seville to Manila because the metal was real. Britain's pound sterling, before 1914, was backed by gold at a fixed rate, for pounds, 25 pence to the ounce, and the Bank of England kept the vaults to prove it. Sound money is not a luxury. It is the foundation. It lets strangers trade, soldiers march, and builders think in decades. Second stage, debt funds expansion. Empires do not stay small. Conquest is expensive. Administration is expensive. Keeping the peace across 1,000 miles of frontier is expensive. And at some point, tax revenue is not enough. So the empire borrows. Rome borrowed against future provincial tribute. Spain borrowed against the silver that would arrive next year from Potosi. Britain issued consols, perpetual bonds that paid interest forever, to fund the Napoleonic Wars and the empire that followed. The debt is rational at first. It finances growth. It buys time. But debt has a ratchet. It does not shrink on its own. Wars end, but the interest payments do not. And the empire, now accustomed to spending beyond its tax base, borrows again to pay the old debt. The ledger becomes a treadmill. Third stage, debasement and the printing press. This is where the currency begins to die. The empire cannot raise taxes high enough. It cannot cut spending without losing legitimacy or control. So it turns to the one power that feels like magic: it changes the money itself. Rome did it slowly, shaving silver content year by year. By the reign of Gallienus in 260 AD, the denarius was less than 5% silver. Soldiers and merchants weighed the coins and refused them. Inflation erupted. Prices in Egypt, tracked on surviving papyri, increased more than 200 times over the 3rd century. Spain did it differently. The silver from the New World was real, but there was too much of it. Between 1500 and 1650, Spanish silver flooded Europe, expanding the money supply faster than the goods it could buy. Prices quadrupled. They called it the price revolution. It was inflation by dilution. The Spanish crown spent the silver on wars and palaces and still went bankrupt 5 times in 100 years, because the money arrived faster than discipline. Britain did it after 1914. The gold standard, the anchor of trust, was suspended to print money for the First World War. It was reinstated in 1925 at the old parity, a mistake that crushed the economy, then abandoned for good in 1931. The pound was no longer a weight. It was a promise, and promises can be revised. The United States did it in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. Dollars had been redeemable for gold at $35 an ounce since Bretton Woods in 1944. On August 15, 1971, that ended. The dollar became pure fiat, backed by nothing but the trust that the issuer would not print without limit. Every empire reaches this stage. The temptation is too great, the alternatives too painful. Fourth stage, the loss of confidence. This is the hinge. Currency is trust made fungible. When trust breaks, the currency does not collapse all at once. It bleeds. People begin to prefer tangible goods over paper. They hoard food, land, silver, anything that cannot be debased by decree. Foreign creditors stop lending, or they demand higher interest to compensate for the risk that they will be repaid in worthless paper. Trade contracts begin to specify payment in someone else's currency. In 3rd century Rome, people reverted to barter in the provinces. In Weimar Germany in 1923, workers were paid twice a day so they could spend the money before it lost value by evening. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks in November of that year. The Argentine peso, the Turkish lira, the Zimbabwean dollar, all followed the same arc: sound money, then debt, then printing, then the snap of confidence. The mathematics are identical. Only the names change. Which empire do you think we are most like right now? Tell me below. Fifth stage, reserve currency decline. Not every empire issues the reserve currency of its age, but the ones that do face a special kind of collapse. A reserve currency is the money that other nations hold, that international debts are settled in, that central banks stockpile because it is trusted more than their own. Rome's denarius was that currency for the Mediterranean. The Spanish silver real was that currency for global trade in the 1600s. The British pound held that role from the 1800s until 1944. Then it was the dollar. Reserve status gives an empire an extraordinary privilege: it can export its inflation. It can print money and buy real goods from abroad, because foreigners need that money for their own trade. But privilege has a price. It requires relentless trust. The moment that trust cracks, the privilege becomes a liability, because the world is holding vast amounts of your currency and they will try to exit at once. Britain learned this after 2 world wars. By 1944, the empire was bankrupt, the pound was weak, and the United States held 70% of the world's monetary gold. At Bretton Woods, the dollar replaced sterling as the global reserve. The handover was not signed in a single ceremony. It happened over decades, as central banks quietly sold pounds and bought dollars, as oil was priced in dollars instead of sterling, as the old empire slowly lost the privilege of printing money the world would accept. The mechanics were inevitable. Britain had debased the currency, borrowed beyond its means, and the world stopped believing. Sixth stage, collapse and reset. The empire does not vanish overnight. It fragments, it declines, it loses provinces and prestige. But the currency dies first. And eventually, someone, whether a successor state or a foreign power, introduces a new money, often backed once again by something real, and the cycle begins again. Constantine Solidus rose from the ashes of the denarius. The gold standard emerged after the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars. Bretton Woods imposed a gold-backed dollar after the autarky and inflation of the 1930s and 40s. The reset is painful. Savings are wiped out. Debts are defaulted or inflated away. But the ledger clears, and trust, carefully, begins to rebuild. Here is the false belief that every empire holds at the peak: we are different. Rome believed it was eternal. Spain believed God had granted it infinite silver. Britain believed the empire could borrow and print without limit because sterling was trusted everywhere. The United States, after 1971, believed the dollar's reserve status was permanent, that fiat currency backed only by the full faith and credit of the government was a new paradigm, a break from the old constraints of metal and weight. But the belief that this time is different is not a break from the pattern. It is part of the pattern. It is the symptom that appears right before stage 4. Confidence is highest just before it breaks. So how do you read the warning signs? Watch the currency, not the speeches. Watch the debt-to-revenue ratio. When an empire cannot finance its promises through taxes and must borrow or print perpetually, the clock is ticking. Watch the composition of the money. When gold clauses disappear from contracts, when the link between paper and metal is severed, when money becomes fully abstract, trust is now the only anchor. And trust is fragile. Watch what foreign central banks do quietly. Are they buying your bonds or selling them? Are they diversifying reserves, asking for payment in other currencies, hoarding gold? Watch inflation, not the official figures but the lived experience, what a house costs, what food costs, how long savings hold value. And watch the rhetoric. When the empire insists loudly that the currency is strong, that inflation is transitory, that debt does not matter because we owe it to ourselves, the protest is a signal. Confidence does not need to be defended when it is real. The pattern has repeated for 3,000 years. Empires rise on money people trust, expand on borrowed time, debase the currency when the bills come due, lose the confidence of their own citizens and the world, and collapse into a reset that clears the ledger and begins the cycle again. The sequence is mechanical. It does not require corrupt leaders or foreign invasions, though those often arrive on schedule. It only requires the incentives that every empire faces, the pressure to spend, the impossibility of raising taxes without limit, and the printing press that offers one more year of reprieve. The currency dies before the empire does. Subscribe to see the warning signs before they make the history books.